words adapted from Psalm 98. O sing a new song to the Eternal. Shout praise, all earth, break into music and song. Praise the Eternal with lyre and song. Let the sea and all within it thunder praise, the world and its inhabitants. Let the rivers clap their hands, let the mountains sing in chorus. O sing a new song to the Eternal. Our opening hymn this morning is Blessed Motion by Annie Zylstra. She wrote this song when she was inspired by the words of Martin Prechtel, who spoke of what it was like to have survived an earthquake in Guatemala. Prechtel spoke of what it was like to have the ground beneath his feet, that which had always been so permanent and so solid, suddenly rise up in motion. He said that the myth of believing in solid ground is a myth believed by those that live on the earth, rather than as a part of it. I know for the last year now, I've been constantly searching for some sense of grounding, even as it feels like the ground beneath my feet is constantly shifting. If that's been true for you as well, I invite you into the spirit of this song, to be in motion together with the earth. I believed in solid ground until I saw the earth in motion, in the winds of steady change, and the ever-rolling ocean. All moves on in perfect motion. All is change and ever rolling ocean. All moves on. Do that low part two more times. Perfect motion. All is change and ever rolling ocean. All moves on in perfect motion. All is change and ever rolling ocean. I believed in solid ground until I saw the earth in motion, in the winds of steady change, and the ever-rolling ocean. I believe in solid ground. I saw the earth in motion, the waves of steady change, and the ever-rolling ocean. I believe in solid ground. Until I saw the earth in motion, in the waves of steady change, and the ever-rolling ocean. I believe in solid ground. Until I saw the earth in motion, in the waves of steady change, and the ever-rolling ocean. I believed in solid ground until I saw the earth in motion, in the waves of steady change, and the ever-rolling ocean. I believed in solid ground until I saw the earth in motion. Just as the light of a single candle transforms the darkness, may our every word and deed transform our hearts and give shape to our communities. And just as the symbol of the chalice calls to mind the history that we have inherited, may it also call us to work for the future that we have envisioned. Desmond the mouse lived in the most beautiful meadow in all the land. Every morning, Desmond would wake with the sunrise and spend the day playing in the meadow. And every evening, Desmond would go to sleep in the middle of that meadow under the beautiful starry sky. One night, though, Desmond awoke when it was still dark out. He tried to roll over to a more comfortable spot, but something wasn't right. Desmond realized that his tail was stuck right to the ground and beginning to throb with pain. He felt behind him, and there was a huge boulder that seemed to have fallen in the middle of the meadow just on his tail. Desmond pushed on the boulder and he tugged on his tail. And he pushed on the boulder and tugged on his tail, and he pushed and tugged and pushed and tugged. And when he was out of breath and had just about given up, he saw a giraffe nearby in the grass. Good news, he thought. "Oh, giraffe," Desmond cried. "It seems that a boulder has fallen in the middle of the meadow just on my tail. I'm stuck and it hurts. Could you please push the boulder just a few inches in the other direction so I could go free?" The giraffe looked at Desmond and laughed the way giraffes do. "Silly mouse," said the giraffe. "That's no boulder. That's an elephant that has fallen asleep just on your tail in the middle of the meadow." "Well, thank goodness," said Desmond, a little relieved. "If you could just wake the elephant gently and ask him to roll over a few inches in the other direction, I could go free." "Well," replied the giraffe, "you know what they say about letting sleeping elephants lie. I find it's best not to get involved in other animals' business. I find it's best to remain neutral in times like this." Desmond replied quietly, "I do not appreciate your neutrality." The giraffe wandered off, and Desmond tried calling out to wake the elephant up, but those giant ears were just too far away on the other side of that giant elephant body. So again, Desmond pushed on the elephant and tugged on his tail, and he pushed and tugged and pushed and tugged. When he was out of breath and had just about given up again, he saw a gazelle wander by. "Oh, gazelle," he cried. "Oh, gazelle, it seems that an elephant has fallen asleep just on my tail in the middle of the meadow. I'm stuck and it hurts. I wonder if you could gently wake him up and ask him to roll over just a few inches in the other direction so I could get free." "Well," said the gazelle, "you know what they say about letting sleeping elephants lie. I find it's best not to get involved in other animals' business. I find it's best to remain neutral in times like this." Desmond replied almost to himself this time, "I do not appreciate your neutrality." Desmond tried again to call out to the elephant. He tried again to push the animal away. He tried again and again to tug his little tail free, but it was no use. When he was out of breath and had just about given up for the last time, he saw another mouse wander through the meadow. Desmond called out, and the mouse scurried over and introduced himself. "My name is Nelson. Nelson, this giant elephant has fallen asleep just on my tail in the middle of the meadow. I wonder if you might run over and call out to his giant elephant ears and ask him to roll over just a few inches in the other direction so I could go free." "Of course," said Nelson. Nelson ran all the way to the other end of that giant elephant body, and he called up to those giant elephant ears at the top of that giant elephant head. But the elephant didn't budge. The elephant heard Nelson's small voice far away, but just felt too comfortable to move. Nelson ran back to Desmond and, a little out of breath, said, "I have an idea. Stay right here." He ran off, leaving a confused look on Desmond's face. A little while later, though, Desmond saw Nelson emerge through the tall grass, and he wasn't alone. Nelson had found 3 mouse friends to help him, and each of them had found another 3 friends. The whole group of them ran over to that giant head at the other end of that giant elephant, and one mouse scrambled up on the shoulders of another, and another mouse scrambled up on her shoulders, and one after another they climbed up, until the whole group of them had formed a long mouse ladder right up the side of that elephant. At last, Nelson climbed up the shoulders of all of his mouse friends, one on top of the other, until he was all the way on top of that giant elephant head, standing right next to that giant elephant ear. "Excuse me," he called out right into that ear. "It seems you've fallen asleep on my friend's tail in the middle of this meadow. I wonder if you could just roll over a few inches in the other direction so he could go free." The giant elephant made a low groan. "Umph. I'm comfortable just where I am. Go away." So Nelson asked more of his mouse friends to climb up. One by one, they helped each other up the side of that elephant. One by one, they called out into that giant ear on top of that giant elephant head, and the elephant made a low groan again. "Umph. I'm comfortable just where I am. Go away." But then Nelson had an idea. He whispered to the mice, and then all at once together they yelled right into that ear, "Excuse us. It seems you've fallen asleep on our friend's tail in the middle of this meadow. Roll over just a few inches in the other direction so he could go free." This time, all of those voices together right next to his ear were just too loud to ignore. "I was comfortable where I was, but I'll move over if you just agree to stop making such a racket," the elephant cried out. And then the elephant rolled over just a few inches in the other direction. Nelson and the other mice climbed up, helped each other back down, and Desmond was finally free. Together they spent the rest of the day playing in the middle of that beautiful meadow. Archbishop Desmond Tutu has said, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have taken sides with the oppressor. If an elephant is standing on the tail of a mouse, the mouse will never appreciate your neutrality." As Unitarian Universalists, we are called to be in covenant together, to be in relationship together, to work together to make the world a better place. We've articulated a vision of justice and equity and compassion, and we've named that vision in our principles and in our communities. And so sometimes we take sides for justice. We take sides for equity and for compassion. Sometimes, perhaps even always, we work together to side with love. Channels for the streams of love, that they may broadly run them everyone. Make channels for the streams of love, and they may broadly run, and love has overflowing streams to fill them everyone. But if at any time we cease such channels to provide, the very founts of love for us will soon be parched and dry. For we must share if we would keep this gift all else above. We cease to give, we cease to have. Such is the law of love. We cease to give, we cease to have. Such is the law of love. These words come to us from Mickey Scott Bay Jones in her Invitation to Brave Space. Together we will create brave space, because there is no such thing as safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars, and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and more love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side. I start nearly every day with a to-do list, usually scribbled on a post-it note on the corner of my desk. Between you and me, it's usually an overly ambitious to-do list. And one thing in particular that I struggle to check off the list most days is making time for writing. It's not that I'm not dedicated. I'm so dedicated to being a writer that every day I put it on the list. I'm so dedicated that every day I read books about writing and collect story ideas and quotes and prompts so that when I do write, I'll have lots of inspiration. I'm so dedicated that every day I work on other things and I finish other pressing commitments so that eventually I'll have lots of time to write. I'm so dedicated that certainly one of these days I'll start writing. One of my favorite authors, Anne Lamott, talks about this, about how hard it is in fact to just sit down every day and put your butt in the chair and write. She says, "The discouraging voices will hound you. This is all piffle," they will say. And they might be right. What you are doing may just be practice, but this is how you're going to get better. Some of the best writing advice I ever got was from a teacher who told me, "For now, take a few minutes and don't write, but just write what you would write if you were going to write." I sometimes feel like in all the years since I've gotten that advice, I haven't written anything since, but I have written a lot about what I would write if I did. You might call this the practice of practicing, learning how to practice. The problem is that the finished product we might imagine for ourselves can feel too far from where we're starting. The person we would like ourselves to be can sometimes feel so far from the person we see in the mirror every day. The world as we would like it to be can feel impossibly far from the headlines we read in the news every morning. The demons of perfectionism stand in the way of good writing, just as they stand in the way of risk-taking in general, creative risk-taking in particular. And this is unfortunate because we know that creating a life for ourselves that doesn't yet exist requires some creative risk-taking. Particularly in uncertain and anxious times such as these, just showing up as your best self every day requires setting aside those discouraging voices that hound us. And on many days, while just imagining a world of justice and equity and compassion, it can feel so far beyond any horizon that we can see that it means setting aside those voices that show up and say your efforts are just piffle. When the demons of perfectionism show up like this, I try to practice the practicing of showing up, for myself and for others. Musicians know something about practicing. One of the requirements for all students at Berklee College of Music, where I attended years ago, is 4 semesters of ear training. Ear training is learning to sight sing music just by reading the notes on a page, and learning to write down and transcribe the music just by listening to a song. Now, when I began school, I certainly knew that there were people who were capable of this kind of magic, but it seemed like some kind of Harry Potter nonsense to me. Like, you may as well ask me to sit at my desk and use my conductor's baton to turn the desk into a toad. I remember our first day of ear training class as there was a sort of nervous silence among us new students. Well, silence actually except for one student who was quite vocal in his nervousness. This one student interrupted the teacher in the first few minutes of the very first day to share that he was worried the class was going to be too advanced for him. He wanted to make it clear that he knew, in fact, not a single thing about ear training. The teacher kindly paused his introductions to explain that
We'd all taken entrance exams, and he was sure we'd been placed in the appropriate class. The teacher tried to continue, but was interrupted again. "Well," the man said, "is this the very lowest class, though? Because I need to be in the very lowest class." Some of the students in the class giggled a little bit, and you could tell our poor teacher looked around the room a little sheepishly, not really wanting to answer that, yes, we were in fact a class of the most very basic students. "Well," he said, "it is ear training 101, so it is the lowest. There is, I guess, a class for people that have previously failed the 101, but you all are just about the lowest." Now, while some of the other students giggled, I was actually kind of glad that someone was questioning what felt to me like the absurd notion that sight singing even could be taught. I don't know what happened next for that student, but he never came back to our class. Not because anything we did on that first day was in fact too hard for him, I'm sure of it, but because I think he lacked a belief that improvement was even possible. I kept going, thinking that, well, if generations of students have done this before, it must be possible somehow, even if I personally can't see the way forward. And I made a commitment to at least practice the material. I've always remembered this other student, though, who gave up before he started. It's not just that he didn't try to become a master at ear training. It's that he didn't even try the practicing of it, which always struck me as the real loss. When discouraging voices hound me, I sometimes think of him, and I remind myself that maybe, for now, the work I'm doing is just practice. But practice is how I'm going to get better. This pandemic arrived nearly a year ago, and it has been a difficult year to be sure. A time of constant adaptation, of the ground shifting beneath us constantly. I imagine that the future, much like this past year, will be a time of learning and relearning new ways of being together, of organizing our days differently, organizing our people differently, all over again. This is a time of adaptation, and it is also a time of imagination. This is a time as we reorganize ourselves and reorganize our society. This is a time for those in power, which in some ways is all of us, to learn to play some different roles in our communities, to learn some new tunes. Particularly for white folks, this is a time to practice some new skills and learn to play some new roles in our community, a time for listening in deeper ways we haven't always done so well before, and having some hard conversations we haven't yet practiced enough. Fellow white folks, when you hear people of color making demands these days, now is a good time to practice amplifying those voices that fight to be heard elsewhere, by repeating them in calls to your representatives and colleagues and family. If you inherited wealth that was accumulated in a time of systematic racial segregation, which is true of all wealth in this country, now is a good time to practice giving it away. If your muscle memory has been to call the police when something goes wrong, now is the time to practice something different, building new skills for community safety. I won't all of a sudden do all of these things, but I will practice the doing of them. Musicians know as well as anyone that muscle memory is very real. That consistent practicing changes the very structure of our brains, rewiring our circuitry, forging new connections and new possibilities. No one is born a musician. Musicians are just the ones that learned how to practice. Even songbirds need elder birds to sing to them and teach them their tunes. Practice doesn't make music perfect, but it makes music possible. And so let us practice the practicing together, showing up for ourselves and each other to build a new world of justice and equity and compassion. Practice won't make the world perfect, but it makes a better world possible. Someday Someday I want to be a true expert in justice and compassion. Someday I want to be well practiced at creating that brave space even when there's no such thing as safe space. Someday I want to be masterful at amplifying the voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. And someday I want to be skillful at speaking more truth and more love. Someday I want to be part of transforming our so-called justice system that has hurt so many so deeply. I want to be part of shifting our education system that so far has fast-tracked some to college and sent others to prison. And I want to be part of shifting our energy sector that has been working overtime to overheat our planet. These are daunting tasks, to be sure. On most days, learning to transcribe a symphony seems more manageable. But that's okay, because for now, I don't have to do all of those things. I just need to practice doing what I would do if I were doing them. So dear ones, don't promise to be your best self today. Just practice being the person you would be if you were being your best self. Don't try to rebuild a new world in the image of love this week. Just practice doing what you would do if you had committed to such things. You have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We all have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. So let us start together. Let us grow together. And let us practice together. May it be so. May we make it so.
This song was written by Sarah Lynch Thomason, a climate justice activist in Appalachia. This song, like I think the best music and perhaps like the best faith communities, calls us not to turn away from the crises of our times, but to face the hard and difficult things together and to move forward together. There are more waters rising, this I know, this I know. There are more waters rising, this I know. There are more waters rising, they will find their way to me. There are more waters rising, this I know, this I know. There are more waters rising, this I know. There are more fires burning, this I know, this I know. There are more fires burning, this I know. There are more fires burning, they will find their way to me. There are more fires burning, this I know, this I know. There are more fires burning, this I know. There are more mountains falling, this I know, this I know. There are more mountains falling, this I know. There are more mountains falling, they will find their way to me. There are more mountains falling, this I know, this I know. There are more mountains falling, this I know. I will wade through the water, this I know, this I know. I will wade through the water, this I know. I will wade through the water when they find their way to me. I will wade through the waters, this I know, this I know. I will wade through the waters, this I know. I will walk through the fire, this I know, this I know. I will walk through the fires, this I know. I will walk through the fires when they find their way to me. I will walk through the fires, this I know, this I know. I will walk through the fires, this I know. I will rebuild the mountains, this I know, this I know. I will rebuild the mountains, this I know. I will rebuild the mountains when they find their way to me. I will rebuild the mountains, this rising, this I know, this I know. There are more waters rising, this I know. There are more waters rising, they will find their way to me. There are more waters rising, this I know, this I know. There are more waters rising, this I know.
Beloveds, don't promise to be your best self today. Just be the person you would be if you were practicing being your best self. Don't try to rebuild a new world in the image of love this week. Just practice doing what you would do if you had committed to such beautiful things. You have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow, and so let us start together and grow together, and let us practice together. Go in peace. Go in love, and go and be blessed as you are a blessing to others.